The dispatcher's voice was still in the paramedic's ear when they stepped into the Palmdale apartment and felt the air change. It was quiet in the way a place gets quiet after something terrible has happened. In a bedroom, an 8-year-old boy lay naked and unresponsive. His skin showed bruising and burns, and his body was frighteningly small for his age. The adults hovering nearby spoke fast, offering explanations that didn't match what was in front of them. The medics dropped to their knees, checked for breath, and when they found none, they moved into emergency rhythm, hands, commands, equipment, trying to pull a child back from a place he should never have reached. The boy was Gabriel Daniel Fernandez. On May 22, 2013, his mother, Pearl Fernandez, called 911 and said her son was not breathing. When sheriff's deputies arrived, Pearl told them Gabriel had fallen and hit his head on a dresser. Paramedics and hospital staff saw far more than a fall could explain. In medical findings described later, Gabriel's injuries included severe head trauma, broken ribs, burns, and evidence that he had been shot with a BB gun, with pellets recovered from his body. In the ambulance, the injuries were obvious even before imaging confirmed them. At the hospital, scans showed the kind of trauma doctors associate with repeated violence: a fractured skull, rib fractures that were not all the same age, and a BB lodged inside his body. He was transferred to Children's Hospital Los Angeles, where he was declared brain dead. He died on May 24, 2013. That morning, the news moved through the same channels that had carried earlier warnings: school staff, neighbors, and officials who had seen Gabriel's name before. At Summerwind Elementary, teachers who had watched him flinch at sudden movement learned he was in critical condition. They remembered the days he arrived with marks he tried to hide, the way his voice sounded when he asked questions about being hit, and the moments he seemed to shrink from ordinary touch. The adults who had tried to help were left with the sick feeling that they had been documenting a tragedy in slow motion. Gabriel had been born on February 20, 2005, and his early years were unstable, moving between caregivers. By 2012, he was back in his mother's home in Palmdale. Pearl lived with her boyfriend, Isauro Aguirre, in an apartment that looked ordinary from the outside, the kind of place where doors shut and life disappears behind thin walls. Inside, Gabriel became the target. The violence followed a pattern: control, punishment, humiliation, and escalation, all happening in a space where an adult's word carried more weight than a child's bruises. The pattern leaked into public view. Gabriel appeared at school with injuries that didn't fit childhood roughhousing. He looked withdrawn and hungry. His first-grade teacher, Jennifer Garcia, noticed bruises and marks and made reports. She called again when the injuries continued. Each time she was told someone would investigate. Visits happened. Conversations took place with the adults in the home. But the most important person in the case was the smallest, and the adults who controlled him controlled what others were allowed to see. Behind the apartment door, the cruelty escalated. Evidence later presented in court described beatings that left deep bruises, burns inflicted on his skin, and pellet gun shots that left BBS lodged in his body. He was deprived of food, leaving him malnourished. The abuse was not a single loss of control. It was repeated and deliberate, punishment layered on punishment until the boy's body carried a history of pain. Other children in the home later described fear and the sense that the adult's anger could erupt without warning, but Gabriel was the one it returned to again and again. By the spring of 2013, his injuries were no longer isolated incidents. Doctors later described patterns consistent with repeated assault, including fractures in different stages of healing. When the final assault came, it left Gabriel unable to respond. Pearl's emergency call came at the end of a chain of violence that had already done irreversible damage. In the hospital, the reality was clinical and brutal. The injuries were extensive, and the timeline of wounds pointed to sustained abuse. The story offered inside the apartment could not hold up against what the body showed. As Gabriel lay connected to machines, investigators began reconstructing his last months. Deputies interviewed Pearl and Aguirre. Medical professionals shared what they were seeing. Pearl Fernandez and Isauro Aguirre were arrested after Gabriel was found unresponsive. After he died, the charges escalated to first-degree murder with special circumstances tied to torture. Detectives gathered school records, hotline reports, witness statements, and forensic findings. The story that formed was not of a sudden accident, but of an escalating pattern that had been visible, reported, and still left a child trapped. When the case reached court, the facts came out with a steadiness that made them harder to escape. Doctors testified about injuries consistent with sustained abuse, including evidence of BB pellets. Witnesses described the environment in the home and the way Gabriel seemed to live under constant threat. Prosecutors argued that the violence was intentional and prolonged. In November 2017, a jury found Aguirre guilty of first-degree murder, and the special circumstance of murder by torture was found true. Pearl Fernandez later chose not to go through a trial. In February 2018, she pleaded guilty to first-degree murder and admitted the torture-murder special circumstance. Sentencing followed in 2018. Pearl Fernandez received life in prison without the possibility of parole. Aguirre received a death sentence under California law. The courtroom consequences were severe, but they could not answer the question that haunted the people who had tried to get help for Gabriel: how a child could show visible injuries, speak up, and still remain trapped. After Gabriel died, vigils formed with candles and stuffed animals, small offerings that could not change the outcome. His name was repeated in hearings and reports, alongside photographs and medical charts that showed what the human body can endure when no one stops the person hurting it. His murder became a grim symbol of institutional failure, as well as personal brutality, and the anger that followed focused not only on the two people who inflicted the abuse, but on the way warning signs had been handled again and again without a decisive rescue. But the central fact of Gabriel Fernandez's story has never depended on policy arguments. It rests on a child in a small apartment, repeatedly harmed by the adults responsible for him, while too many other adults accepted explanations that did not fit the evidence. The last call to 911 was not the beginning of the emergency. It was the end of a long stretch of suffering that should never have been allowed to continue. Thank you for listening to Homicide Files. Subscribe for more true crime stories.